The wilderness is unforgiving and full of secrets. For generations, people have ventured into America's national parks and forests, expecting nothing more than fresh air and beautiful views. Most return home with photos and memories. Some never return at all. These aren't fictional stories or urban legends shared around campfires. These are real disappearances, documented by park rangers, investigated by search and rescue teams, and recorded in official missing persons files. People with names, families waiting at home, and mysteries that remain unsolved decades later. From the towering peaks of Yosemite to the dense forests of the Great Smoky Mountains, America's wilderness holds secrets that challenge everything we think we know about getting lost. GPS devices, cell phones, and modern search techniques haven't stopped people from vanishing. In some cases, they've made these disappearances even more impossible to explain. The Sailing Stones of Death Valley. Picture this. You're standing in the middle of nowhere, in the hottest, driest place on Earth. Death Valley stretches endlessly around you, a landscape so harsh that nothing should be able to survive here, let alone move. The sun beats down mercilessly on a flat, dry lake bed called Racetrack Playa. But scattered across this barren ground are hundreds of rocks, some as small as your fist, others weighing over 700 pounds, and behind each rock stretches a long straight line carved into the hardpan earth, as if something had dragged these massive stones across the desert floor. The thing is, nothing did drag them. These rocks moved by themselves. The first person to document this impossible sight was a prospector named Joseph Crook in 1915. He'd wandered into this remote corner of Death Valley looking for valuable minerals, but instead found something that defied all logic. Rocks that had somehow travelled hundreds of feet across perfectly flat ground, leaving ruler-straight trails behind them like breadcrumbs marking their journey. When Crook told people what he'd seen, most folks figured the desert heat had gotten to him. Rocks don't just get up and walk around. But over the decades, more and more people ventured into Racetrack Playa and saw the same impossible thing. The trails were real, the rocks were real, and somehow they were moving. By the 1940s, word had spread to the scientific community. Geologists started making the difficult trek to this remote location, 2 hours of rough dirt road from the nearest paved highway. What they found challenged everything they thought they knew about how the natural world works. The tracks weren't random scratches or natural erosion patterns. They were precise, purposeful lines that showed clear evidence of movement. Some trails ran perfectly straight for over 1,500 feet. Others curved gently or made sharp turns. A few rocks had even changed direction multiple times, creating zigzag patterns across the playa. In 1955, geologist George M. Stanley published the first serious scientific study of what locals had started calling the Sailing Stones. Stanley spent months measuring the tracks, studying the rocks, and trying to understand the forces at work. His research revealed that the phenomenon wasn't limited to small pebbles. Boulders weighing hundreds of pounds had somehow glided across the desert, like they were sliding on ice. Stanley proposed the first scientific theory. Flash floods combined with powerful desert winds could create the perfect conditions for rock movement. Rain would occasionally fill the playa with a thin layer of water, turning the clay surface into slippery mud. Then hurricane-force winds sweeping down from the surrounding mountains could push the rocks across this slick surface. When the water evaporated, it would leave behind the mysterious trails. It sounded reasonable enough, but there were problems with the theory. For one thing, Death Valley is famous for its lack of rain. Racetrack Playa might see water once every few years, and even then, just barely enough to wet the surface. The winds, while strong, weren't consistently powerful enough to move 700-pound boulders, and most puzzling of all, no one had ever actually seen the rocks move. Through the 1960s and 70s, more scientists tackled the mystery. Some suggested underground seismic activity might somehow shake the rocks into motion. Others proposed that morning frost could create a slippery surface for movement. A few researchers even considered whether magnetic forces in the rocks themselves could play a role. Each theory had its supporters, but none could fully explain all the evidence. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In the 1990s, a new technology called GPS allowed researchers to track the exact positions of individual rocks over time. Scientists could finally prove that the stones were indeed moving, even when no human was around to witness it. but the GPS data raised more questions than it answered. The rocks moved incredibly rarely, sometimes staying in one position for years before suddenly travelling hundreds of feet in a single event. Paula Messina, a geologist from San Jose State University, spent years using GPS to track over 160 stones. Her data showed that most rocks moved only once every 2 or 3 years. When they did move, it happened during the brief periods when water covered the playa. But even with this evidence, no one could explain the actual mechanism behind the movement. The mystery deepened in 2006 when researchers discovered that some rocks had moved upward, somehow climbing over small ridges in the playa surface. This defied every existing theory about wind and water movement. Whatever was moving these rocks had to be more complex than simple pushing or pulling. For nearly a century, the sailing stones of Death Valley stumped scientists around the world. The phenomenon seemed to violate basic laws of physics. How could massive boulders glide across flat ground with no visible force acting on them? The answer finally came in December 2013, when cousins Richard Norris, a paleobiologist from Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and James Norris witnessed something no human had ever seen before. They'd arrived at Racetrack Playa to check on instruments they'd placed around various rocks. What they found was a thin sheet of ice covering the entire playa, maybe an inch thick at most. As the morning sun hit the ice, it began to break apart into large sheets. These ice sheets, pushed by light morning winds, started moving across the water beneath them, and as they moved, they pushed against the rocks, shoving them along like bulldozers. The force wasn't dramatic or violent. The rocks moved slowly, maybe just a few feet per minute. But that gentle, steady pressure was enough to push even the heaviest boulders across the slick mud surface. When the ice melted completely later that day, it left behind fresh tracks showing exactly how far each rock had travelled. Richard Norris described watching 60 rocks move at once across the playa. It was really eerie, he said. The rocks were making a horrible grinding sound as they moved along the bottom. The sound came from the rocks scraping against the clay surface as sheets of floating ice pushed them forward. This discovery explained all the mysteries that had puzzled researchers for decades. The rocks only moved during rare combinations of rainfall, cold temperatures and wind, conditions that might occur just once every few years. The movement happened slowly and quietly, usually at dawn when no observers were present. The ice sheets could push rocks uphill because they exerted horizontal pressure, not just the downward force of wind or water. But solving the sailing stones mystery opened up new questions about similar phenomena in other locations around the world. Researchers have now identified moving rocks in places like Altiplano in South America, the Atacama Desert in Chile, and several locations in the Arctic. Each site has its own unique conditions, but they all share the basic requirements. A flat surface that can become temporarily slick, temperature conditions that can create ice and wind to provide the pushing force. The sailing stones also revealed something important about how we study natural phenomena. For nearly a century, scientists had all the pieces of the puzzle. They knew about the rare rainfalls, the cold desert nights, the morning winds, and the formation of thin ice sheets. But no one had put these elements together in the right way. It took direct observation of the phenomenon in action to finally understand how these seemingly impossible forces combine to create one of nature's strangest shows. Today, climate change threatens to alter the delicate conditions needed for rock movement at Racetrack Playa. Warmer temperatures make ice formation less likely, while changing weather patterns could eliminate the rare combination of rain and cold needed to create the perfect conditions. Future generations might visit Death Valley and see only motionless rocks and ancient trails, never witnessing the ghostly ballet that once played out under the desert stars. Dennis Martin, the boy who vanished in the Smokies. Some families mark Father's Day with breakfast in bed or a homemade card. But in 1969, William Martin had something more adventurous in mind for his special weekend. The 38-year-old architect from Knoxville, Tennessee, packed up his 2 young sons and his father for a camping trip to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It was meant to be a perfect family bonding experience in one of America's most beloved wilderness areas. William Martin was an outdoorsman who knew these mountains well. He'd chosen Spence Field, a high meadow at 4,900 feet elevation along the Appalachian Trail, as their destination. It was a popular spot for families, with plenty of open space for kids to play and stunning views of the surrounding peaks. The weather forecast looked perfect for their June 14th arrival. Clear skies and comfortable temperatures in the 70s. 6-year-old Dennis Martin was excited about his first real camping adventure. The quiet, well-behaved boy with dark hair and brown eyes had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. His 9-year-old brother Douglas was equally thrilled. Together with their grandfather Clyde, the 4 generations of Martin men set up camp in the grassy meadow, surrounded by the ancient mountains that had watched over countless family gatherings just like this one. Saturday evening brought other families to Spencefield. The Keyes family from Ohio had arrived earlier and set up their camp nearby. Soon the adults were sharing stories around the campfire, while the children played together in the fading daylight. It was exactly the kind of wholesome family experience that had drawn millions of visitors to the Smokies over the years. The next morning dawned bright and clear. After breakfast, the Martin and Key children decided to play a game of hide-and-seek in the open meadow. Dennis, Douglas, and several of the Key children split into 2 teams. The plan was simple. One group would hide behind a small ridge about 100 yards away from the camp, then jump out to startle their fathers who would be walking along the trail. At approximately 2 p.m. on June 14, 1969, Dennis Martin ran toward the wooded area behind the ridge to take his position for the prank. His father watched him disappear into the trees, expecting to see him pop out moments later with the other children. Douglas and the Key children emerged from their hiding spots as planned, laughing and shouting as they surprised the adults. But Dennis never appeared. William Martin waited a few minutes, then called out his son's name. When there was no response, he walked to the ridge where Dennis had gone. He expected to find his son hiding behind a tree, or perhaps sulking after missing out on the game. Instead, he found nothing. No sign of Dennis anywhere. The temperature dropped from casual concern to real worry in a matter of minutes. William organized the other campers to spread out and search the immediate area, calling Dennis's name and checking every possible hiding spot. The boy was small for his age, just 4 feet tall and weighing only 55 pounds, but he wasn't the type to wander off alone or ignore his father's calls. By 3:30 p.m, William Martin knew something was seriously wrong. He hiked quickly to the nearest park ranger station to report his son missing. Park Service protocols kicked in immediately. Rangers began coordinating search teams, while the park's dispatcher sent out calls for additional personnel and resources. The initial search that evening focused on the area where Dennis was last seen. Rangers and volunteers combed through the thick forest surrounding Spencefield, following every possible path the boy might have taken. They used flashlights and called his name throughout the night, hoping to hear a response from somewhere in the darkness, but the ancient mountains remained silent. By dawn on June 15th, the search had expanded dramatically. Park Superintendent George Fry authorized the largest search and rescue operation in Great Smoky Mountains National Park history. Search teams arrived from across Tennessee and North Carolina. Bloodhounds were brought in to track Dennis's scent, while helicopters began aerial sweeps of the rugged terrain. The search grid expanded each day as hundreds of volunteers joined park rangers, local law enforcement and military personnel in scouring the wilderness. The US Army provided helicopters and trained search personnel. Even elite Green Beret units were deployed to search the most challenging terrain, their jungle warfare experience considered valuable for navigating the dense Appalachian forest. One of the most promising leads came on the second day when searchers found a small footprint in soft soil about a mile from Spencefield. The print appeared to match Dennis's size and shoe type, suggesting he had somehow travelled much farther than anyone expected for such a small child. But despite intensive searches of that area, no other traces were found. On the 4th day, searchers discovered what appeared to be fresh scratches on trees and bushes along a creek bed several miles from the campsite. Some investigators believe these marks might have been made by a small child pushing through the undergrowth. Again, teams concentrated their efforts in that region, but found no additional evidence. The search effort eventually involved over 1,400 people covering a 56 square mile area of some of the most challenging wilderness in the eastern United States. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the mountains while ground teams rappelled into deep ravines and explored remote caves. The operation consumed massive resources and attracted national media attention. but Dennis Martin seemed to have vanished without leaving any definitive trace. Strange reports began filtering in from hikers and local residents. Some claimed to have heard a child crying in the woods during the first few nights after Dennis's disappearance. Others reported seeing a small figure moving through the forest at dawn or dusk, but every time searchers investigated these sightings, they found nothing concrete. One witness account proved particularly unsettling. A family hiking near Spencefield on the day Dennis disappeared reported seeing a man in the woods carrying something large and covered. The witness said the man behaved strangely, quickly moving away from the trail when he noticed them watching. When news of Dennis's disappearance spread, this family contacted authorities, but by then several days had passed and the trail was cold. Military involvement in the search raised questions that persist to this day. Some researchers have noted that Green Beret units were conducting classified training exercises in the area around the time of Dennis's disappearance. The military's presence in the search effort, while officially explained as humanitarian assistance, led to speculation about whether something more sensitive might have been involved in the boy's disappearance. After 7 days of intensive searching, park officials made the difficult decision to scale back the operation. The chances of finding Dennis alive had diminished significantly, and the massive search effort was straining park resources and endangering the searchers themselves. The official search was suspended on June 29, 1969, though smaller volunteer efforts continued for several more weeks. Theories about Dennis Martin's fate have evolved over the decades. The official conclusion suggested he became lost in the wilderness and succumbed to exposure or injury. The Smoky Mountains contain thousands of acres of dense forest, steep ravines and dangerous terrain where a small child could easily become trapped or fall. Wild animals, including black bears, posed additional risks. But other theories emerged to explain the unusual circumstances of Dennis's disappearance. Some investigators noted that experienced search dogs seemed confused or agitated in certain areas, as if Dennis's scent trail had been deliberately obscured or contaminated. The lack of any substantial physical evidence despite the massive search effort struck many as unusual for a child who had simply become lost. More controversial theories suggested human involvement in Dennis's disappearance. The witness report of the mysterious man in the woods fueled speculation about abduction. Some researchers have pointed to the rapid military response and the presence of classified units as evidence of a potential cover-up, though no concrete evidence has ever supported such claims. Today, more than 50 years after Dennis Martin vanished from Spencefield, his case remains one of the most puzzling disappearances in national park history. The boy who ran into the woods to play a harmless prank on his father has become the subject of books, documentaries, and countless online discussions. His disappearance helped establish many of the search and rescue protocols still used in national parks today. William Martin never stopped searching for answers about his son's fate. He returned to the Smokies regularly for years, hoping to find some trace of Dennis, or at least understand what happened that Father's Day afternoon. He established a trust fund to support continued search efforts and maintained hope that someday the mountains would reveal their secret. The Dennis Martin case file remains open with the National Park Service, though active investigation has long since ceased. Occasionally, hikers report finding unusual items in remote areas of the park, leading to brief renewed interest in the case. Glenn and Bessie Hyde, the Grand Canyon honeymoon mystery. In the autumn of 1928, America was riding high on jazz music, bootleg liquor, and the wild optimism of the Roaring Twenties. The stock market crash was still a year away, and adventure seekers were pushing boundaries in ways that would seem reckless by today's standards. It was an era when daredevils crossed oceans in tiny planes, when flagpole sitters competed for endurance records, and when the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon represented one of the last great unconquered challenges in the American West. The Colorado River in 1928 was not the managed waterway we know today. There were no dams controlling its flow, no rescue helicopters on standby, and no established protocols for river running. The few people who had successfully navigated the river through the Grand Canyon could be counted on two hands. John Wesley Powell's famous expedition in 1869 had established that it could be done, but nearly 60 years later, running the Colorado remained an endeavour that claimed more lives than it celebrated. Into this dangerous and largely unknown world stepped Glenn Hyde, a 29-year-old adventurer from Idaho, and his 22-year-old bride Bessie, a divorced woman from West Virginia who had been married just 2 months. Their honeymoon plans would have seemed insane to most couples of their generation, but Glenn and Bessie were determined to make their mark on history by becoming the fastest couple to navigate the Green and Colorado rivers from Utah to California. Glenn had built their vessel himself, a 20-foot wooden sweep scow that resembled, in the words of one observer, a large horse trough. The flat-bottomed boat was designed for stability rather than speed, constructed from pine planks and weighing nearly 2 tons when fully loaded. Unlike the smaller, more maneuverable boats used by previous river runners, the sweep scow relied on massive oars called sweeps to navigate rapids. It was an unconventional choice that reflected Glenn's confidence in his own engineering abilities. The couple launched from Green River, Utah, on October 20th, 1928, beginning what they hoped would be a record-breaking journey. Glenn had experience on western rivers, having worked as a trapper and guide in Idaho's wilderness. But Bessie had never been on a serious river expedition before. Despite warnings from experienced river runners about the dangers ahead, she seemed eager to prove that women could handle the Colorado's most challenging rapids. Their early progress was steady but not spectacular. The couple made regular stops to resupply and send telegrams to newspapers that were following their journey. At each stop, they met with local officials and photographers who documented their unusual honeymoon adventure. The press coverage painted them as romantic adventurers conquering the wilderness together, though some observers noted tension between the couple that suggested the journey was testing their new marriage. On November 18th, they reached Bright Angel Creek in the Grand Canyon, where they climbed out to meet Emery Kolb, one of the canyon's most famous photographers and river guides. Kolb operated a studio on the South Rim and had witnessed more river expeditions than almost anyone alive. When he met Glenn and Bessie, he was immediately concerned about their prospects for completing the journey safely. Kolb urged the couple to abandon their trip, pointing out that winter conditions would make the lower rapids even more dangerous than usual. The Colorado's flow was unpredictable, temperatures would drop below freezing at night, and if something went wrong, rescue would be nearly impossible. But Glenn and Bessie were determined to continue. They had come too far and endured too much to give up when they were within days of setting their speed record. Emery Kolb took what would become the last known photograph of Glenn and Bessie Hyde on November 18th, 1928. The image shows them standing on the canyon rim, Glenn with his arm around his wife's shoulders. Bessie's expression is difficult to read. Some observers have described her as looking worried or reluctant, while others see determination in her face. Glenn appears confident and eager to continue their journey. The couple returned to their sweep scow and disappeared into the lower Grand Canyon. They were expected to reach Needles, California by early December, where Glenn's father was waiting to celebrate their achievement. Instead, they vanished into the Colorado River system, leaving behind one of the most enduring mysteries in Grand Canyon history. The first sign that something was wrong came when Glenn's father, R.C. Hyde, received no word from the couple by December 6th. He immediately contacted authorities and organized search parties to look for the missing honeymooners. The search effort was complicated by the remote location and harsh winter weather, but within days, rescue teams were combing the lower Colorado River for any trace of Glenn and Bessie. On December 19th, searchers found the couple's sweep scow floating upright in calm water near mile 237 of the Colorado River. The boat was intact and still contained all of Glenn and Bessie's personal belongings, including Bessie's diary, their camera, and a gun Glenn carried for protection. Food supplies were still stored in waterproof containers, and there was no sign of struggle or distress aboard the vessel. The discovery of the undamaged boat only deepened the mystery. If Glenn and Bessie had been thrown overboard in dangerous rapids, the sweep scow should have shown signs of impact or damage. If they had abandoned the boat deliberately, they would have taken essential supplies with them. The scene suggested that both people had somehow left the boat simultaneously, leaving everything behind. Initial theories focused on the possibility that Glenn and Bessie had been swept overboard by a large wave or had fallen out while trying to navigate a rapid. The Colorado River's cold temperatures would have made survival unlikely for anyone who entered the water without protective gear. Search teams found no bodies, but given the river's treacherous currents and remote location, this wasn't particularly surprising. As weeks turned to months without discovering any trace of the missing couple, more exotic theories began to emerge. Some suggested that Glenn and Bessie had staged their own disappearance to escape debts or family problems. Others proposed that they had been murdered by hermits or outlaws living along the river. A few investigators even considered whether indigenous people in the area might have been involved, though no evidence supported such theories. The investigation took on new dimensions when searchers discovered that the couple's camera contained undeveloped film. When processed, the photographs showed their journey through the Upper Grand Canyon, including images taken just days before their disappearance. The final photos showed no signs of distress or problems with their equipment, but they also provided no clues about what had happened after they were taken. In the decades following the disappearance, the Glenn and Bessie Hyde case became a fixture of Grand Canyon folklore. Every few years, new theories or supposed evidence would surface, keeping the mystery alive in the public imagination. Hikers occasionally reported finding bones or artifacts that might be connected to the missing couple, but forensic analysis always proved these discoveries to be unrelated. The most sensational development came in 1971, more than 40 years after the disappearance, when a woman on a commercial Grand Canyon river trip made a startling claim. During a campfire conversation, she allegedly announced that she was Bessie Hyde, having survived the 1928 incident and lived under an assumed identity ever since. The woman was identified as Georgie Clark, a well-known river guide who had spent decades leading tours through the Grand Canyon. Clark's alleged confession sparked intense interest among researchers and Hyde family members. Investigators noted that Clark's age and physical description roughly matched what Bessie Hyde would have looked like in 1971. She also possessed detailed knowledge of river running techniques and Grand Canyon geography that seemed consistent with having survived the 1928 expedition. However, efforts to verify Clark's claims proved frustrating. She refused to provide definitive proof of her identity and seemed to enjoy the mystery and attention her story generated. When Clark died in 1992, researchers hoped that personal effects or documents might finally solve the riddle, but no conclusive evidence emerged. Modern technology has brought new investigative tools to the Glenn and Bessie Hyde mystery. DNA analysis techniques that didn't exist in 1928 could potentially identify remains if they were ever discovered. Satellite imagery and GPS mapping have allowed researchers to conduct more systematic searches of the areas where the couple might have come ashore. In 1976, a skeleton was discovered on the rim of the Grand Canyon, near where Glenn and Bessie had met Emery Kolb in 1928. Initial reports suggested the remains might belong to one of the missing honeymooners, but forensic analysis determined they were from a different time period entirely. Similar false alarms have occurred periodically, keeping hope alive while ultimately providing no answers. The Hyde case has also benefited from advances in our understanding of Colorado River hydraulics and accident patterns. Modern river safety experts have analysed the location where the sweep scow was found and the probable conditions Glenn and Bessie would have encountered. These studies suggest that the couple most likely encountered a hydraulic feature, a type of water formation that can trap boats and swimmers that pull them under while leaving their vessel undamaged. Contemporary river guides point out that Glenn's sweep scow design, while stable in calm water, would have been extremely difficult to control in emergency situations. The massive steering oars required significant strength and experience to operate effectively, and a moment's hesitation or miscalculation in dangerous rapids could prove fatal. The boat's weight and design might have actually worked against the couple in crisis situations. The psychological factors affecting long river expeditions are better understood today than they were in 1928. Modern research has shown that extended exposure to stress, physical exhaustion, and isolation can impair judgment and decision-making abilities. Some investigators now wonder whether Glenn and Bessie might have made critical errors in their final days that contributed to their disappearance. The Glenn and Bessie Hyde mystery continues to influence how we approach river safety and missing person investigations in wilderness areas. Their case helped establish many of the search and rescue protocols still used in national parks today. The National Park Service now requires detailed registration for all river expeditions, maintains better communication with parties in remote areas, and has developed rapid response capabilities that didn't exist in 1928. Stacy Arras, the Yosemite photography trip. Every summer, thousands of families pack their cameras, hiking boots, and sense of adventure for a trip to Yosemite National Park. They come to witness towering granite cliffs, thundering waterfalls, and ancient sequoia groves. Most return home with memory cards full of stunning photographs and stories that will last a lifetime. But in July 1981, one family's dream vacation became a nightmare that has haunted investigators for over 4 decades. 14-year-old Stacy Arras was the kind of teenager who found beauty in everything around her. Born on September 29, 1966 in Saratoga, California, Stacy was a quiet, thoughtful girl who loved nature and had recently developed a passion for photography. Her father, George, a building inspector, had saved up for months to give his daughter the ultimate outdoor experience, a 4-day horseback riding and camping trip through some of Yosemite's most spectacular backcountry. George Arras wasn't just any weekend warrior taking his daughter on a casual trail ride. He was an experienced outdoorsman who had spent countless hours exploring California's wilderness areas. When he booked the pack trip through Saddle and Surrey stables, he chose one of the most reputable outfitters in the region, known for their safety record and experienced guides. The trip would take them through high country that most park visitors never see, staying at established camps in the Sierra Nevada mountains. On July 14, 1981, Stacy and her father joined 6 other riders for what promised to be an unforgettable journey. The group included experienced hikers and horse riders, led by professional guides who knew every trail, stream, and camping spot in their planned route. Stacy brought along her camera equipment, including a telephoto lens she was eager to use for wildlife photography in the pristine wilderness. The first 3 days of the trip unfolded exactly as planned. The group rode through meadows filled with wildflowers, across crystal-clear streams, and along ridgelines that offered breathtaking views of the Sierra Nevada range. Stacy proved to be a capable rider and an enthusiastic photographer, often falling slightly behind the group, as she stopped to capture images of birds, deer, and the stunning mountain scenery. By July 17th, the group had reached their final overnight stop at Sunrise High Sierra Camp, located at 9,270 feet elevation along the backcountry trail system. The camp consisted of several canvas tent cabins scattered through a grove of pine trees, offering a comfortable base for exploring the surrounding high country. It was a popular destination for serious backpackers and horse riders, but remote enough that cell phone service was non-existent and the nearest road was miles away. That morning dawned clear and beautiful, with temperatures expected to reach the mid-70s, perfect weather for their planned activities. After breakfast, the group prepared for their final day of exploration before beginning the journey back to the trailhead. Some members planned to hike to nearby Tenaya Lake, while others wanted to explore the granite formations that made this area famous among rock climbers. Stacy had different plans. She wanted to spend the morning taking photographs in the area around the camp, particularly focusing on some wildlife she'd spotted the previous evening. She told her father and the group that she preferred to work alone with her camera, as groups of people tended to scare away the animals she hoped to photograph. This was typical behavior for Stacy. She was serious about her photography, and often worked better without the distraction of conversation and movement from other people. Around 2 p.m. on July 17, 1981, Stacy Arras walked away from Sunrise High Sierra Camp to take photographs. She carried her camera bag with multiple lenses and was wearing a red t-shirt, blue jeans, and hiking boots. Several members of the group watched her head toward a small meadow about 100 yards from the camp, moving slowly and stopping frequently to adjust her camera settings and frame shots. George Arras expected his daughter to return within an hour or two, as she typically did during her solo photography sessions. When 4 p.m. came and went with no sign of Stacy, he began calling her name and walking toward the area where she'd been last seen. Other members of the group joined the search, assuming she'd simply become absorbed in her photography and lost track of time. By 6 p.m., casual concern had turned to serious worry. The group had searched every likely spot where Stacy might have gone to take pictures, calling her name continuously and checking behind boulders, trees and ridgelines where she might have wandered. The terrain around Sunrise High Sierra Camp, while beautiful, contained numerous hazards including steep drop-offs, unstable rock formations, and areas where a person could easily become trapped or injured. The camp staff immediately initiated emergency protocols, sending riders toward the nearest ranger station while organizing a systematic search of the immediate area. As darkness approached, the temperature began dropping rapidly, a serious concern for anyone caught outdoors without proper gear. Stacy had been dressed for a warm afternoon of photography, not for spending a night in the wilderness at over 9,000 feet elevation. Park Service search and rescue teams arrived at Sunrise High Sierra Camp early on July 18th, beginning one of the largest search operations in Yosemite's history. The challenging terrain and remote location complicated rescue efforts, but within 24 hours, dozens of searchers were combing the area around the camp. Helicopters conducted aerial surveys while ground teams followed every possible route Stacy might have taken. The first significant discovery came on the second day of the search. Approximately 150 yards from where Stacy was last seen, searchers found a lens cap from her telephoto lens lying on the ground near a small stream. The lens cap was the only physical evidence ever found despite an intensive search that eventually covered over 1,400 square miles of wilderness. The location of the lens cap raised immediate questions. It was found in an area that search dogs had already covered, suggesting it might have been placed there recently. More puzzling was the fact that Stacy was an experienced photographer who was meticulous about her equipment. Losing a lens cap would have been immediately noticeable to her, and she would have stopped to retrieve it rather than continuing without this essential piece of gear. Search teams expanded their efforts to cover an increasingly wider area, as days passed without finding any additional traces of Stacy. The terrain they were searching included steep granite cliffs, dense forest, alpine meadows, and numerous caves and crevices where a person could become trapped. Bloodhounds were brought in to track Stacy's scent, but the dogs seemed confused and unable to establish a clear trail beyond the immediate area where the lens cap was found. As the search entered its second week, investigators began exploring theories beyond a simple hiking accident. The complete lack of physical evidence was unusual for someone who had simply become lost or injured in the wilderness. Experienced searchers noted that even in fatal accidents, victims typically left behind clothing, personal items, or other traces of their presence. The remote location and timing of Stacy's disappearance raised questions about possible human involvement. Sunrise High Sierra Camp was isolated enough that unauthorized individuals could potentially operate without being detected by other visitors. Some investigators wondered whether Stacy might have encountered someone who posed a threat, though no evidence supported this theory. Wildlife encounters represented another possibility investigators couldn't ignore. Black bears were common in the area, and while attacks on humans were rare, a surprised or defensive bear could potentially cause serious harm. Mountain lions also inhabited the region, though sightings were uncommon. However, predator attacks typically left evidence that search teams would have discovered. The search operation continued for over a month, eventually involving more than 150 personnel and costing an estimated $60,000. Helicopters flew grid patterns over hundreds of square miles, ground teams rappelled into remote ravines, and divers searched mountain lakes and streams. Despite this massive effort, no additional evidence was found beyond the single lens cap discovered in the first days of the search. One of the most frustrating aspects of the investigation was the lack of any clear direction for Stacy to have travelled. The terrain around Sunrise High Sierra Camp offered numerous possible routes, from well-established trails to trackless wilderness areas. Without additional physical evidence or witness sightings, searchers had no way to focus their efforts on the most likely areas. Weather conditions during Stacy's disappearance were generally favourable, which made her vanishing even more mysterious. There were no sudden storms, temperature extremes, or other environmental factors that might have contributed to disorientation or accident. The clear skies that made for perfect photography conditions should have also made it easier for searchers to spot any sign of her presence. As weeks turned to months without breakthrough discoveries, investigators began considering more unconventional theories. Some researchers noted that Stacy's disappearance shared characteristics with other mysterious vanishings in national parks, experienced outdoors people vanishing without trace in areas that were thoroughly searched. This pattern would later become part of the missing 411 phenomenon, documented by researcher David Polides. The Stacy Arras case file remains active with the National Park Service more than 40 years after her disappearance. Advances in search technology, including GPS tracking, improved communication systems, and sophisticated aerial surveillance, have not provided any new leads in her case. Occasional reports from hikers who claim to have found bones, clothing, or equipment in remote areas of the park are investigated, but none have proven connected to Stacy's disappearance. Modern forensic techniques that didn't exist in 1981, including DNA analysis and enhanced photographic examination, offer potential tools for solving the case if any physical evidence is ever discovered. The single lens cap found during the initial search has been preserved and could potentially yield new information with current technology. George Arras never stopped hoping for answers about his daughter's fate. He returned to Yosemite regularly for years, sometimes accompanied by private investigators or psychics who claimed to have insights into the case. The family offered rewards for information and worked with various missing persons organizations to keep Stacy's case in the public eye. The impact of Stacy's disappearance extended beyond her immediate family to influence search and rescue protocols throughout the national park system. Her case highlighted the challenges of conducting wilderness searches in remote, mountainous terrain and led to improvements in communication systems, search techniques, and coordination between different agencies. The Yellowstone thermal deaths. The call came in at 2:17 p.m. on July 20th, 1981. Park Ranger Emergency Dispatcher received a frantic report from the Fountain Paint Pot area of Yellowstone National Park. A man had jumped into one of the thermal pools in an apparent rescue attempt. By the time the first responders arrived at the scene, they found themselves confronting one of the most horrific accidents in the park's history, and the beginning of an investigation that would reveal the deadly patterns hidden within Yellowstone's most beautiful attractions. David Allen Kerwin, a 24-year-old from La Canada, California, lay critically burned on the boardwalk near Celestine Pool. His friend Ronald Ratliff stood nearby, also severely injured but conscious. Both men had suffered third-degree burns over most of their bodies. More shocking was what witnesses reported. Kerwin had deliberately jumped into the 202-degree Fahrenheit water to save Ratliff's dog, which had fallen into the thermal pool while they were sightseeing. Chief Ranger Dan Scholle arrived at the scene within minutes of the initial call. What he found defied everything he thought he knew about human behavior in emergency situations. "I've seen a lot of accidents in my career," Scholle later told investigators, "but I've never seen someone make a conscious decision to enter water that was obviously lethal. The steam rising from that pool was clearly visible. Any reasonable person would know it was superheated." The immediate investigation focused on reconstructing the sequence of events that led to the tragedy. According to witness statements, Kerwin and Ratliff had been walking their friend's small dog near the thermal features when the animal somehow escaped from its leash and ran towards Celestine Pool. The dog, apparently attracted by the warm water, jumped in and began yelping in distress. Emergency medical technician Sarah Martinez was among the first responders to treat Kerwin. Her report, filed later that day, contained details that haunted the rescue team for years afterward. "The patient was conscious and talking when we reached him," Martinez documented. "His first words were asking about the dog. He seemed unaware of the severity of his own injuries. He kept saying he had to save the dog." Dr. Robert Thompson, the emergency room physician who treated Kerwin at the Regional Medical Center, provided crucial testimony about the nature of thermal injuries that would reshape how investigators understood these accidents. "Burns from geothermal water are unlike anything else we see in emergency medicine," Thompson explained to the investigation team. "The combination of extreme heat and the chemical composition of these springs creates injuries that are both extensive and immediate. There's no survival time once you're fully immersed." Park Service investigators began interviewing the dozen witnesses who had been present at Fountain Paint Pot during the incident. Their accounts revealed disturbing details about the moments leading up to Kerwin's decision to enter the water. Multiple witnesses reported that Kerwin had hesitated for several seconds, clearly aware that entering the pool would be dangerous, before ultimately jumping in to attempt the rescue. Witness Janet Coleman provided particularly detailed testimony. "I saw the dog fall in and start crying. The man looked around like he was hoping someone else would help. Then he looked at his friend, who was obviously upset about the dog. The man said something like, 'I have to do something,' and went in after it. I screamed for him to stop, but he was already in the water." The technical analysis of the incident required expertise from multiple scientific disciplines. Dr. Michael Stevens, a geothermal specialist from the US Geological Survey, was brought in to analyze the specific conditions at Celestine Pool. His findings revealed why the rescue attempt was doomed from the start. Celestine Pool maintains a constant temperature between 200 and 205 degrees Fahrenheit, Stevens reported. At that temperature, human tissue begins cooking immediately upon contact. The chemical composition includes high concentrations of sulfur and other compounds that make the water highly acidic. Even if someone could somehow survive the heat, the chemical burns would be fatal. Stevens' analysis also revealed that the pool's depth made rescue attempts impossible even with proper equipment. The pool drops to over 15 feet deep almost immediately from the edge. The thermal currents create strong downward flows that would pull any object toward the bottom. Even trained rescue divers with protective equipment couldn't operate safely in those conditions. The investigation expanded to examine similar incidents throughout Yellowstone's history. Park historian Lee Whittlesey compiled a comprehensive database of thermal feature deaths dating back to the park's establishment in 1872. His research revealed disturbing patterns that had never been formally analysed. What we discovered was that thermal deaths in Yellowstone fall into distinct categories, Whittlesey explained to investigators. About 30% involve children who wander away from their parents and accidentally fall in. Another 40% are adults who deliberately leave the designated boardwalks to get closer to the features. The remaining cases involve rescue attempts like Kerwins, or people who are under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Whittlesey's data analysis revealed 22 documented deaths from thermal features between 1872 and 1981, with several additional probable cases where bodies were never recovered. The number might seem low given the millions of visitors we've had over the decades, Whittlesey noted, but each incident follows remarkably similar patterns. People consistently underestimate the danger posed by these features. The psychological analysis of the Kerwin incident was conducted by Dr. Patricia Mills, a behavioral specialist who studied decision-making under extreme stress, where her findings challenged assumptions about how people react in emergency situations involving beloved pets. Research shows that many people will take extraordinary risks to save their animals, often treating them like family members, Mills reported. In high-stress situations, people can make decisions that seem irrational to outside observers, but feel necessary to them in the moment. Kerwin's actions, while tragic, follow predictable patterns of human behavior under extreme emotional pressure. Mills interviewed Kerwin's family and friends to understand his personality and decision-making patterns. Everyone described him as someone who always tried to help others, Mills documented. He had rescued injured animals before and had trained in wilderness first aid. His decision to enter the pool wasn't impulsive recklessness. It was consistent with his established behavior patterns. The investigation team also examined the dog's behavior to understand how the initial accident occurred. Animal behavior specialist Dr. James Rodriguez analyzed witness statements and physical evidence from the scene. His conclusion surprised many investigators. Dogs are naturally attracted to warm water sources, especially in cooler weather, Rodriguez explained. What makes thermal pools particularly dangerous for animals is that they can't detect the extreme temperature until they're already in contact with the water. Unlike humans, dogs don't recognize steam as a warning sign of dangerous heat. Rodriguez's analysis revealed that the pool's location made the accident almost inevitable. Celestine Pool sits at ground level with no significant barriers. From a dog's perspective, it would appear to be an inviting water source. The tragedy is that once an animal enters these pools, rescue is impossible even with proper equipment. The technical investigation also examined whether existing safety measures were adequate to prevent similar incidents. Engineering consultant David Walsh assessed the boardwalk design and signage around thermal features throughout the park. The infrastructure at Fountain Paint Pot was typical for the early 1980s, Walsh reported. Wooden boardwalks with basic warning signs, but no physical barriers preventing access to the thermal pools. The assumption was that adult visitors would exercise common sense and stay on designated paths. Walsh's analysis identified several factors that contributed to the severity of the incident. The boardwalk design actually made rescue attempts more likely by providing easy access to the pool's edge. Someone attempting a rescue could reach the water quickly, but emergency responders couldn't deploy safety equipment effectively from that position. The investigation's findings led to immediate changes in park safety protocols. Dr. Thompson's medical analysis showed that thermal injuries required specialized treatment that wasn't available at most regional hospitals. The Park Service established new procedures for medical evacuation and arranged for burn specialists to be on call during peak visitor seasons. Chief Ranger Sholly implemented revised training protocols for all park personnel based on the investigation's psychological findings. "We learned that people will attempt rescues regardless of danger when animals are involved," Sholly explained. "Our rangers now receive specific training on how to prevent rescue attempts and how to respond when they occur anyway." The Kirwan case also led to infrastructure changes throughout Yellowstone's thermal areas. Walsh's engineering recommendations resulted in higher railings, improved signage, and strategic placement of emergency equipment near high-risk pools. "We can't prevent all accidents," Walsh noted, "but we can make it harder for people to make fatal decisions in the heat of the moment." Follow-up studies conducted 5 years after the incident revealed the long-term impact on witnesses and first responders. Dr. Mills documented cases of post-traumatic stress among people who had watched the rescue attempt, highlighting the psychological toll these events take on entire communities. "Thermal accidents affect everyone who witnesses them," Mills reported. The witnesses to Kirwan's rescue attempt described feeling helpless and guilty for years afterward. Several required counselling to deal with the trauma of watching someone die while trying to help an animal. The investigation's findings contributed to a broader understanding of human behaviour in national parks. The Kirwan case became a touchstone for researchers studying risk assessment and decision-making in wilderness environments. His decision to attempt an impossible rescue revealed both the nobility and the fatal flaws in human nature when confronted with emergency situations. Maurice Dametz, the vanishing geologist. The morning ritual was as familiar as breathing. Every Tuesday and Thursday, weather permitting, 84-year-old Reverend Maurice "Doc" Dametz would gather his rock hunting equipment and head out to explore the mineral-rich terrain around Colorado Springs. On April 29, 1981, the spring air was crisp and clear, perfect conditions for what Doc called his treasure-hunting adventures in the Pike National Forest. Maurice Gordon Dametz was no ordinary weekend rock hound. Born in Blue Rapids, Kansas in 1896, he had lived a life of remarkable intellectual achievement. He held degrees from multiple institutions, including a master's from the University of Denver and a Doctor of Divinity from Rockmont College. For decades, he'd served as a Presbyterian minister, authored several religious books, and edited Christian magazines. But his true passion, especially in his later years, was geology and mineral collecting. Doc's interest in rocks and gems wasn't casual hobby collecting. He was a serious student of mineralogy, a member of the American Federation of Mineral Societies, and the Flatirons Gem and Mineral Club. His home in Longmont, Colorado contained display cases filled with carefully catalogued specimens he'd collected over the years. Each piece was labelled with its location, date of discovery, and geological significance. By 1981, age and arthritis had slowed Doc considerably. He couldn't navigate rough terrain alone anymore, which is why his friend David McSherry had become his regular companion on these expeditions. McSherry, a younger man with a good understanding of Doc's physical limitations, served as both driver and assistant, helping the elderly minister reach promising dig sites that would have been impossible for him to access independently. Their destination that Tuesday was a spot near Devil's Head Lookout, along Rampart Range Road, a scenic 38-mile unpaved route through the Front Range of Colorado. The area was known among local rockhounds for producing quality topaz specimens, the clear, sometimes blue-tinted crystals that form in granite pegmatites common to the region. Doc had been to this general area before and knew it held promise for serious collectors. The drive from Longmont took about 2 hours, winding through increasingly mountainous terrain until they reached the Rampart Range Road turnoff. McSherry parked near a small sandy area close to the road where previous collectors had obviously worked before. The elevation here was around 8,500 feet, and despite the late April date, patches of snow still lingered in shaded areas between the ponderosa pines. Doc was dressed practically for the day's work. A white baseball cap to protect his head from the high-altitude sun, a maroon plaid flannel shirt for warmth, and sturdy brown work boots suitable for the rocky terrain. He carried his usual collection of small tools, a geological pick, a brush for cleaning specimens, small bags for storing finds, and a magnifying glass for examining crystal structures. The two men established their separate work areas around 1 p.m. Doc chose a spot near some exposed granite where previous collectors had begun excavating a small pit. The sandy soil here was easier for him to work with given his physical limitations, and the granite formation suggested the possibility of finding topaz crystals in the surrounding pegmatite veins. McSherry set up his own dig site about 50 yards away, close enough to keep an eye on his elderly friend, but far enough to give them each adequate space to work. This arrangement had become their standard practice over months of collecting trips. Doc preferred to work methodically and quietly, examining each piece of rock carefully before deciding whether to keep it or discard it. For the next 2 hours, both men worked steadily at their respective sites. The afternoon was peaceful, with only the sounds of their tools scraping against rock and the occasional call of mountain birds. Doc appeared to be having good luck, periodically holding up small specimens to examine them in the sunlight before placing them in his collection bag. Around 3 p.m, McSherry decided it was time to begin wrapping up their expedition. The drive back to Longmont would take several hours, and Doc tired easily in the late afternoon. McSherry walked over to Doc's dig site to let him know they should start packing up soon. Doc acknowledged the message, saying he just wanted to finish examining one more section of the pit before calling it a day. McSherry returned to his own site to begin cleaning up his tools and organising the specimens he'd collected. The process took about 15 minutes as he carefully wrapped the more delicate pieces and secured everything in his collecting bag. When he finished packing his equipment, he walked back toward Doc's location to help him gather his materials and assist him in the walk back to their vehicle. The dig site was empty. Doc's geological pick lay beside the small pit he'd been working, but Doc himself was nowhere to be seen. McSherry called out his friend's name, thinking perhaps Doc had walked a short distance to examine another rock formation, or had stepped behind some trees for privacy. There was no response. McSherry's concern escalated quickly. He knew Doc's physical condition made it virtually impossible for him to walk any significant distance without assistance, especially over the uneven, rocky terrain surrounding their dig sites. Doc's arthritis and blood disorder left him weak and unsteady on his feet. He simply couldn't have wandered far on his own. A systematic search of the immediate area revealed nothing. McSherry checked behind boulders, looked into small ravines, and called Doc's name continuously. The most puzzling aspect of the scene was that Doc's tools were missing along with him. His geological pick, collection bags, and other equipment had vanished as well, suggesting this wasn't a case of Doc simply wandering away and becoming lost. By 4 p.m, McSherry knew something was seriously wrong. He hiked back to Rampart Range Road and flagged down the first vehicle he saw, a pickup truck carrying other recreationists who had been exploring the area. McSherry explained the situation and asked them to help search while he drove to find a phone to contact authorities. The Douglas County Sheriff's Office received McSherry's call around 6 p.m. Deputies immediately began coordinating a search and rescue response, but the remote location and approaching darkness complicated their efforts. The first rescue teams didn't reach the dig site until nearly 11 p.m, working by flashlight to examine the area where Doc had last been seen. Search and rescue coordinator Captain James Wilson organised a grid search pattern beginning at first light on April 30th. Teams of volunteers, deputies and trained search specialists began combing the mountainous terrain around Devil's Head Lookout. The search area was expanded each day as teams found no trace of Doc or his equipment. Bloodhounds were brought in on the second day of the search, but the results were puzzling. The dogs seemed unable to establish a clear scent trail leading away from Doc's dig site. They would circle the immediate area where he'd been working, become agitated or confused, then lose the scent entirely. Experienced dog handlers noted that this behaviour was unusual for a normal lost person case. The terrain around the search area presented both opportunities and challenges for the investigation. The mountainous landscape included numerous caves, deep ravines, and dense forest where someone could become trapped or hidden. But the same features that might conceal a missing person also made it difficult to believe that an 84-year-old man with mobility issues could have travelled far enough to reach them. Captain Wilson interviewed McSherry extensively about the events of April 29th. McSherry's account remained consistent through multiple interviews. Doc had been working at his dig site when McSherry left him at 3 p.m. and had vanished completely by 3:15 p.m. The 15-minute window seemed impossibly short for Doc to have travelled any significant distance on his own. Investigators also examined the dig site for any signs of struggle or violence. The sandy soil around Doc's pit showed no evidence of a fight, no bloodstains, and no indication that he had been forcibly removed from the area. His work area appeared undisturbed except for the missing tools and Doc himself. Search teams expanded their efforts to cover over 40 square miles of mountainous terrain over 5 days. Helicopters conducted aerial sweeps while ground teams explored every accessible cave, ravine, and forest area within a reasonable distance of the dig site. Despite this extensive effort, no trace of Doc or his equipment was ever found. Local wildlife officials were consulted about the possibility of an animal attack, but their assessment deemed this highly unlikely. Mountain lions and black bears inhabited the area, but attacks on humans were extremely rare, and such incidents typically left clear evidence at the scene. No signs of predator activity were found at Doc's dig site. The investigation took an unusual turn when Doc's wife, Myrtle, wrote to Colorado Governor Richard Lamb requesting a more extensive investigation. In her July 18, 1981 letter, she expressed concern that Morris might have met foul play or been carried out of the area. She requested state resources be dedicated to solving the case, but no additional evidence was uncovered despite renewed investigation efforts. Theories about Doc's disappearance have evolved over the decades since 1981. The official investigation concluded that he likely became disoriented, wandered away from his dig site, and succumbed to the elements somewhere in the vast wilderness area. His advanced age and health problems supported this conclusion, though it failed to explain how he could have travelled far enough to avoid detection by extensive search efforts. More controversial theories have suggested that Doc's disappearance might have involved foul play. Some researchers have noted that his valuable mineral collection and expertise in locating profitable dig sites could have made him a target for robbery. The fact that his tools disappeared along with him suggested a level of planning inconsistent with a random crime of opportunity. The most puzzling aspect of the case remains the complete absence of any physical evidence. In wilderness disappearances, search teams typically find at least some traces of the missing person: clothing, personal items, or human remains. Doc's case is unusual for the total lack of any discoveries despite massive search efforts and the passage of 4 decades. David McSherry, the last person to see Doc alive, has maintained his original account of the events throughout multiple interviews over the years. Some investigators have questioned whether McSherry's story contains inconsistencies, but no evidence has ever suggested his involvement in Doc's disappearance. Modern search techniques and technologies that didn't exist in 1981 have been applied to the case sporadically over the years. Ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and GPS mapping have all been used in limited follow-up searches, but none have yielded new evidence about Doc's fate. Doc was officially declared dead in 1990, 9 years after his disappearance. His case file remains open with the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, and occasional reports from hikers who discover bones or artifacts in the Pike National Forest still generate brief investigative interest. However, none of these discoveries have proven connected to Doc's case. The Mount Shasta disappearances. For thousands of years before European explorers ever laid eyes on its snow-capped peak, Mount Shasta had already earned a reputation as a place where people disappeared. The Wintu, Shasta, Modoc, and other indigenous tribes who lived in its shadow wove cautionary tales about the 179-foot volcano that dominated the Northern California landscape. They spoke of spirits that dwelled within the mountain, of sacred springs that could transport souls to other realms, and of warnings to approach the Great White Peak with proper respect and ceremony. The indigenous peoples of the region didn't just see Mount Shasta as another geographic feature. To them, it was the axis of the world, a place where the boundary between the physical and spiritual realms grew thin. Wintu legends described the mountain as the birthplace of their people, emerging from a sacred spring somewhere on its slopes. The Shasta tribe, from whom the mountain takes its name, believed powerful beings lived inside the peak, controlling weather patterns and the fate of those who ventured too close without permission. When the first Euro-American settlers arrived in the 1820s, they found these indigenous warnings about the mountain's supernatural properties amusing or primitive. Fur trappers, gold miners, and later railroad workers dismissed native stories as superstition. But as decades passed, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. People who went up Mount Shasta didn't always come back down. The earliest documented disappearance occurred in 1854, when prospector James Wickham vanished while searching for gold in the mountain's lower reaches. His partners found his camp intact, his supplies untouched and his mule still tied to a tree. Wickham himself had simply vanished. Local indigenous people nodded knowingly when they heard the story. The mountain had claimed another life. By the 1870s, Mount Shasta's reputation for mysterious disappearances was becoming well established among the growing population of Northern California. The famous naturalist John Muir, who climbed the peak in 1874, wrote about feeling an overwhelming sense of being watched during his ascent. He described hearing voices calling his name from empty ravines and experiencing periods where time seemed to move differently than normal. The late 19th century brought new types of visitors to Mount Shasta, drawn not just by its natural beauty, but by growing legends about its mystical properties. Occultist Guy Ballard claimed to have encountered an ascended master named Saint Germain on the mountain slopes in 1930. Ballard's writings about hidden civilizations inside Mount Shasta sparked a spiritual movement that continues today, but they also marked the beginning of a new chapter in the mountain's history of disappearances. The modern era of Mount Shasta mysteries began in earnest after World War II, as improved roads made the remote peak more accessible to recreational climbers and spiritual seekers. Between 1950 and 2000, at least 15 people vanished on or near Mount Shasta under circumstances that defied conventional explanation. Unlike typical mountaineering accidents, these disappearances often occurred in good weather, involved experienced outdoors people, and left no physical evidence despite extensive search efforts. One of the most puzzling cases occurred in May 1999, when 69-year-old Carl Landers of Orinda, California disappeared during what should have been a routine climb. Landers was an experienced mountaineer and marathon runner who had previously summited Mount Shasta multiple times. He was climbing with two companions, Milt Gaines and Barry Gilmore, both equally experienced in high-altitude mountaineering. The group had established their base camp at Horse Camp, a traditional staging area at 7,900 feet elevation. On May 25th, they began their summit attempt under clear skies and mild weather conditions. The plan was straightforward: climb together to Helen Lake at 10,400 feet, then continue as a group toward the summit if conditions remained favorable. At Helen Lake, Landers made a decision that his companions found completely out of character. He announced that he was feeling strong and wanted to continue toward the summit alone, while Gaines and Gilmore planned to rest and acclimate before making their own summit push. Landers was known for his methodical, safety-conscious approach to mountaineering. Splitting up from his climbing partners violated every principle of safe mountain travel he had followed for decades. Gaines and Gilmore watched Landers climb toward the Red Banks, a series of reddish volcanic cliffs at around 12,500 feet. The weather remained clear, visibility was excellent, and Landers appeared strong and confident as he climbed. He was wearing bright red clothing that would be visible from miles away on the mountain's white slopes. The last time his companions saw him, he was moving steadily upward, about halfway between Helen Lake and the Red Banks. When Landers failed to return to their agreed meeting point by evening, Gaines and Gilmore assumed he had decided to make camp higher on the mountain and would descend the next morning. This was unusual behaviour for Landers, but not impossible given his experience and the favourable weather conditions. They spent an uncomfortable night worrying but expected to see him at first light. By the second day, with no sign of Landers, his companions knew something was seriously wrong. They climbed back up the route he'd taken, following his tracks in the snow for several hundred yards above Helen Lake. Then, inexplicably, his footprints simply vanished. Not gradually, as if he'd changed direction or moved onto harder snow, but abruptly, as if he had somehow been lifted off the mountain. The search for Carl Landers became one of the largest rescue operations in Mount Shasta's history. The Siskiyou County Sheriff's Office coordinated efforts involving dozens of volunteers, professional search and rescue teams, and military helicopters. The search area eventually covered the entire upper mountain, from Helen Lake to the summit and down all possible descent routes. Despite perfect weather conditions and unlimited visibility, searchers found no trace of Landers beyond his footprints, ending at 10,800 feet elevation. No equipment, no clothing, no signs of avalanche or rockfall, no evidence of a fall into a crevasse. His red jacket should have been visible from aircraft for miles in any direction, but aerial surveys revealed nothing. The investigation into Landa's disappearance revealed disturbing patterns consistent with other Mount Shasta cases. Experienced outdoors people vanishing without trace in good weather, sudden changes in behavior immediately before disappearance, complete absence of physical evidence despite massive search efforts. And most puzzling of all, the involvement of companions who witnessed the beginning of the disappearance, but could provide no explanation for what happened next. Search and rescue coordinator Tom Steenstra, who had participated in dozens of mountain rescue operations throughout California, called the Landa's case unlike anything I'd encountered before. The complete absence of clues defied everything Steenstra knew about missing person cases in wilderness areas. People don't just vanish into thin air, he noted, but that's exactly what seems to have happened. The advancement of search technology in the 1990s and 2000s should have made Mount Shasta disappearances easier to solve, but the opposite proved true. GPS tracking, cell phone communications, and satellite imagery were all becoming available to search teams, yet people continued to vanish on the mountain just as completely as their predecessors had in previous decades. Modern psychological analysis of Mount Shasta cases has identified several consistent factors that distinguish them from typical wilderness disappearances. Victims often exhibit sudden personality changes or make uncharacteristic decisions immediately before vanishing. They frequently separate from companions despite having strong safety-conscious backgrounds, and they tend to disappear during periods of good weather when rescue should be most likely. Dr. David Paulides, a former police detective who has studied unexplained wilderness disappearances, has identified Mount Shasta as one of the most statistically significant locations for mysterious vanishings in North America. His research suggests that the mountain's disappearance rate far exceeds what would be expected based on visitor numbers and terrain difficulty alone. The geological characteristics of Mount Shasta may contribute to its mysterious properties. The mountain is an active volcano with extensive cave systems, underground thermal features, and areas of unstable terrain that could potentially conceal remains indefinitely. Some researchers have suggested that unique electromagnetic fields generated by the volcanic activity might interfere with navigation equipment or even human brain function. More controversial theories about Mount Shasta disappearances have focused on the mountain's reputation for paranormal activity. The area attracts thousands of visitors annually who come specifically seeking spiritual experiences or UFO encounters. Some investigators have wondered whether the same unknown forces that create these reported phenomena might also be responsible for the disappearances. The cultural impact of Mount Shasta mysteries extends far beyond the missing person cases themselves. The mountain has become a focal point for researchers studying unexplained phenomena in wilderness areas. Documentary filmmakers, podcast hosts, and authors regularly feature Mount Shasta cases in discussions about the limits of conventional search and rescue techniques. Local search and rescue protocols have evolved significantly in response to the mountain's unusual disappearance patterns. Teams now document psychological profiles of missing persons, maintain detailed databases of environmental conditions during disappearances, and coordinate more closely with academic researchers studying the phenomena. The indigenous peoples who first warned about Mount Shasta's supernatural dangers view the modern disappearances as confirmation of their ancestral wisdom. Tribal elders from the region have noted that the missing persons cases cluster in areas they traditionally considered dangerous or sacred, places where their people would only travel with proper spiritual preparation. Today, Mount Shasta continues to attract both outdoor enthusiasts and spiritual seekers, despite, or perhaps because of, its reputation for mysterious disappearances. The mountain serves as a living laboratory for researchers trying to understand why certain wilderness areas seem to have higher rates of unexplained vanishings than others. Each new case adds to the growing database of information about this phenomenon, but definitive answers remain as elusive as the missing people themselves. Brandon Swanson, the oh shit phone call. The phone rings at 1:54 a.m. on May 14, 2008. Brian Swanson reaches for the receiver, instantly alert. His 19-year-old son, Brandon, is on the line, and something's wrong. "Dad, I'm in the ditch. I need you to come get me." Brian Swanson would later recall that first conversation with crystal clarity. Brandon sounded calm, maybe a little frustrated, but not panicked. He said he'd driven into a ditch somewhere near Lind and couldn't get his car out. He asked us to come pick him up. Annette Swanson remembers waking to her husband's voice in the hallway. I heard Brian talking, and I knew immediately it was Brandon. There was something in Brian's tone that made me get up. A mother knows. Within minutes, both parents were dressed and in their truck, heading toward the small town of Lind, about 10 miles northwest of their home in Marshall, Minnesota. Brian kept Brandon on the phone, trying to pinpoint his exact location. He kept saying he was near Lind, Brian recalls. He could see lights in the distance that he thought were the town. We drove to where we thought he was, flashing our headlights, honking the horn, but we couldn't see him and he couldn't see us. The confusion was immediate and unsettling. Brandon insisted he could see the lights of Lind clearly. He described seeing what looked like a town ahead of him, but his parents, searching the area he indicated, found nothing. It was so frustrating, Annette remembers. We're driving around, calling his name, flashing our lights. Brandon's on the phone saying he can see lights, but we can't find him anywhere. Nothing made sense. As the minutes stretched on, Brandon's frustration grew. During that first half hour of searching, he made a decision that would haunt his parents forever. I'm going to start walking toward the lights, Brandon told them. I'll meet you in Lind. Brian tried to talk him out of it. I told him to stay with the car. It was dark, it was late, but Brandon was determined. He said he could see the town lights clearly, and it wasn't that far. What followed was a 47-minute phone conversation that began as a simple coordination call and ended in mystery. Brandon stayed on the line with his father as he walked through the rural Minnesota landscape in complete darkness. He was describing what he saw as he walked, Brian remembers. He said he was walking along a fence line. He mentioned he could hear water running somewhere nearby. At one point, he said he was going to cut through a field to get to town faster. The details Brandon provided painted a picture of the Minnesota countryside at night. Rolling farmland, barbed wire fences, the sound of flowing water, gravel roads cutting through endless fields of corn and soybeans. He talked about stumbling a few times, Brian recalls. The ground was uneven. He mentioned it was muddy in places, but he sounded okay. Tired, maybe a little out of breath from walking, but okay. Annette, sitting beside her husband in their truck, could hear fragments of Brandon's voice through the phone. I kept wanting to take the phone and tell him to stop walking, to just wait for us. But Brian was trying to guide him, trying to figure out where he was. As Brandon walked, he continued to describe landmarks. He mentioned seeing lights that he thought were from houses. He talked about crossing through what felt like farmland. The conversation had an almost routine quality, a father and son coordinating a meetup, both working toward the same goal. But something was wrong with the geography. The landmarks Brandon described didn't match what his parents were seeing in the Lind area. The lights he claimed to see weren't visible to them. The roads he mentioned didn't exist where he said they should be. Looking back, that should have been our first clue, Brian says. But in the moment, we just thought he was confused about where he was. It was dark, he'd been at a party, maybe he was more turned around than we realised. At approximately 2:30 a.m., 47 minutes into their phone conversation, Brandon's voice suddenly changed. All of a sudden, he said, "Oh shit!" really loud, like he was surprised or scared, Brian recalls, his voice still heavy with the memory. And then the line went dead. The silence that followed was deafening. Brian immediately tried calling back. The phone rang, but Brandon didn't answer. He tried again, and again. Each unanswered ring felt like a punch to the gut. I must have called him back 20 times in those first few minutes, Brian says. It just went straight to voicemail. "Hey, this is Brandon. Leave a message," over and over. Annette describes those moments as the beginning of their nightmare. When that phone went dead, I knew something terrible had happened. You don't just hang up on your parents like that, especially when they're trying to help you. Brandon would never do that. The couple continued searching throughout the night, driving the back roads around Lind, calling Brandon's name into the darkness. They checked ditches, looked for any sign of their son. They found nothing. As dawn broke on May 14th, the Swansons made the call every parent dreads. At 6:30 a.m., they contacted the Lyon County Sheriff's Office to report their son missing. The initial response was disappointing. The deputies kind of brushed us off at first, Annette remembers. They said kids Brandon's age disappear all the time, that he'd probably show up in a day or two with a hangover and a story. But the Swansons knew better. This wasn't like their son. Brandon was responsible, reliable. If he said he'd meet them somewhere, he showed up. If he had his phone, he answered it. The breakthrough came later that day when investigators traced Brandon's cell phone records. The last ping from his phone hadn't come from near Lind at all. It had come from a cell tower near the town of Taunton, about 25 miles southwest of where Brandon claimed to be. Search teams immediately shifted their focus to the Taunton area. That's where they found Brandon's green Chevrolet Lumina, sitting in a ditch along a gravel road near the Lincoln County line. The car was undamaged, keys still in the ignition, Brandon's glasses on the dashboard. Seeing that car was almost worse than not finding anything, Annette says, because then we knew for sure that something had happened to him. He wouldn't just abandon his car like that. Search dogs picked up Brandon's scent at the vehicle and tracked it to a field, then to the Yellow Medicine River, where the trail went cold. The implication was clear but unbearable. Brandon had likely fallen into the river during his walk in the darkness. But questions remained. Why had Brandon been so confused about his location? How had he ended up 25 miles from where he thought he was? And what exactly had happened in that final moment when he cried out and the phone went dead? I've replayed that phone call in my head thousands of times, Brian says. Every word, every pause, every sound in the background. I keep thinking there was something I missed, some clue that could have helped us find him. The tone of Brandon's final exclamation has been analysed endlessly by investigators, family members, and amateur sleuths. Was it surprise? Fear? Pain? Did he fall into the river? Encounter someone dangerous? Step into a hidden hole or abandoned well? The way he said it, it was like something sudden happened, Brian recalls. Not like he was gradually getting into trouble. It was immediate, like, oh shit, what's this? And then nothing. Annette has her own interpretation. I think he fell, she says simply. I think he was walking in the dark, maybe following what he thought was a path or a road, and he fell into something, the river, maybe, or a ditch he couldn't see. Environmental factors that night certainly contributed to the tragedy. It was a moonless evening with heavy cloud cover. The rural area where Brandon was walking had no streetlights, no illuminated landmarks. Temperature was in the low 40s, creating ground fog in some areas. People don't realise how dark it gets out there in farm country, says Lyon County Sheriff Joel Dahl, who led the initial search efforts. City folks are used to some ambient light, but out in those fields, especially on a cloudy night, you literally cannot see your hand in front of your face. The psychological impact on witnesses, particularly Brandon's parents, has been profound and lasting. Brian and Annette Swanson became reluctant experts in missing person cases, eventually advocating for legislative changes that became known as Brandon's Law. We learned that in Minnesota, if an adult goes missing, police don't have to start looking for 48 hours, Brian explains. They assume the person left voluntarily, but in cases like Brandon's, those first 48 hours are critical. We couldn't wait. The law they championed requires law enforcement to begin investigating adult missing person cases immediately if there are circumstances suggesting the disappearance is involuntary or the person may be in danger. Brandon's case changed how missing adults are handled in this state, says retired investigator Gary Peterson, who joined the search efforts. Before, if you were over 18 and disappeared, authorities assumed you had the right to disappear. Now they look at the totality of circumstances. The case has attracted national attention over the years, featured in numerous podcasts, documentaries, and true crime discussions. But for the Swansons, media attention is a double-edged sword. On one hand, we want people to remember Brandon to keep his case alive, Annette says. But sometimes the speculation gets painful. People have theories about what happened, and some of them are just cruel. Over the years, psychics have contacted the family with supposed visions of Brandon's fate. Conspiracy theorists have suggested everything from alien abduction to government cover-ups. Well-meaning strangers have claimed to have spotted Brandon in distant cities. We followed up on every credible lead, Brian says, but after 17 years we've learned to filter out the noise and focus on facts. The facts remain stubbornly few. Brandon's phone contained no unusual activity before his disappearance. His bank account showed no withdrawals after May 13th. His social media accounts went silent. Every tangible trace of Brandon Swanson ended at 2:30 a.m. on a gravel road in rural Minnesota. People ask us if we still hope he's alive, Annette says, As a mother, part of me will always hope, but logically, we know he's gone. We just want to bring him home. The Yellow Medicine River has been searched repeatedly over the years using boats, divers and sonar equipment. The surrounding farmland has been walked by hundreds of volunteers. Metal detectors have swept the area looking for Brandon's phone, wallet or any personal effects. In 16 years of searching, we haven't found so much as a button from his clothes, Peterson notes. It's like he just vanished into thin air. The case has taken its toll on the entire Swanson family. Brandon's younger sister Jameen was just 17 when he disappeared. Her high school graduation overshadowed by the massive search efforts for her brother. She's had to live her whole adult life in the shadow of this mystery, Annette says. Getting married, having children, all the normal milestones, while we're still searching for Brandon, it's affected all of us. Today a porch light still burns at the Swanson home in Marshall, left on since the morning of May 14, 2008. It's become a symbol not just of hope, but of the enduring love of parents who refuse to let their son be forgotten. That light stays on until we know what happened to him, Brian says. It's the least we can do. Brandon called us for help that night, and we're still trying to help him, even now. The final words Brandon Swanson spoke to his father have become part of Minnesota folklore. 2 words that encapsulate the sudden transition from routine family crisis to inexplicable tragedy. The Devil's Den time slip. There are places on Earth where reality seems to bend at the edges, where the familiar laws of physics appear to take a coffee break. Devil's Den State Park in Arkansas is one of those places. Ask any park ranger who's worked there long enough, and they'll tell you stories that don't make it into the official incident reports. In June of 1977, Staff Sergeant Terry Lovelace was living what most would consider a routine military life. Based at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, he worked the graveyard shift as an EMT, responding to medical emergencies across the sprawling complex that housed nuclear-armed B-52 bombers and intercontinental ballistic missiles. "I was just a medic," Lovelace recalls decades later, his voice still carrying the measured tone of someone trained to remain calm under pressure. "My partner Toby and we'd sit on the ambulance ramp most nights waiting for calls. Toby was this kid from Flint, Michigan, brilliant with numbers, wanted to study astronomy. We'd watch the stars together between emergencies." That routine had already been shattered 2 years earlier during a call that officially never happened. Lovelace and his partner had responded to an accident at a missile silo designated Kilo 5, only to find themselves witnesses to something the military would later insist was a classified experimental helicopter. It was diamond-shaped, black as night, hovering 20 feet over the silo, Lovelace remembers, size of a van just sitting there in mid-air. No rotors, no sound, no visible means of support. Then it shot off from a dead stop to bullet speed without any acceleration. Physics doesn't work that way. The official debriefing that followed was intimidating and thorough. Their reports were confiscated and rewritten. They were warned never to discuss what they'd seen, but the experience had bonded the 2 young airmen in a way that would prove both fateful and tragic. 2 years later, in June 1977, Toby suggested they take a camping trip. Neither had ever been camping before, but Toby had been researching locations where he could practice astronomy away from the base's light pollution. He'd settled on Devil's Den State Park, a 500-acre preserve in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas. Toby was excited about the high plateau at Devil's Den, Lovelace recalls. He said we could see the stars clearly there, and I could practice my wildlife photography. I'd gotten a new camera I wanted to try out, since photography wasn't allowed on base. The 4-hour drive south toward the Arkansas border should have been routine, but somewhere along the way Lovelace made a discovery that would haunt him for decades. "I'd left my damn camera on the kitchen counter," he says, still frustrated by the memory. "Here I was, planning this whole photography expedition, and I'd forgotten the one thing I needed most. But we were already committed to the trip, so we decided to make the best of it." They arrived at Devil's Den in the late afternoon, parking at the official campground before hiking deeper into the preserve. Against park regulations, they decided to set up camp on a remote plateau, away from other visitors. Toby didn't want to camp in what he called a parking lot in the woods, Lovelace explains. He wanted complete darkness for stargazing, so we trespassed into the nature preserve area that was off limits to camping. Their first evening passed quietly enough. They set up their small tent on the edge of a plateau that bordered a tree line, ate their provisions and settled in to watch the night sky. Lovelace describes feeling unusually tired despite the excitement of their first camping adventure. "We were exhausted from the hike and setting up camp," he recalls. Around 9 o'clock, Toby noticed 3 stars on the horizon, except they weren't stars. They formed a perfect triangle and moved in complete unison. What happened next challenges conventional understanding of time, space, and human consciousness. The 2 airmen watched as the triangular formation of lights grew larger and closer, eventually revealing itself to be a single, massive object. "It became obvious this was one solid craft, not 3 separate lights," Lovelace says. "As it passed through the star field, it would blot out the stars until it moved past them. Then they'd blink back on. It was enormous, and it was coming directly toward our campsite." The object's approach should have terrified the 2 young men. Instead, Lovelace describes a strange sense of detachment settling over them, as if their natural fight-or-flight response had been chemically suppressed. The whole forest went dead silent, he remembers. An hour earlier it had been alive with crickets and tree frogs. Now there was nothing, and we became disinterested. Not tired, but almost sedated. At midnight we just decided to get in the tent and go to sleep. The apathy puzzles me to this day. This is where Terry Lovelace's account enters territory that challenges everything we think we know about linear time. According to his recollection, he next woke up at 3 a.m. to brilliant multicoloured lights illuminating the inside of their tent. White, yellow, and orange light was flooding through the tent walls, he says. "I looked through a small net window